about 3 Vega tips. So I'm going to give you guys 3. I don't know if they're really tips. They're more like characteristics or features of Vega that can be really, really helpful to understand when you're trying to measure the volatility exposure that you might have on a current position, that you might have on a new trade that you are considering, or that you might be looking at, with your portfolio in an overall sense to kind of get some idea of how exposed you might be to volatility. Now, I don't look at Vega that often. It's kind of the forgotten Greek. I mean, not as forgotten as Rho, but we don't look at it nearly as much as like a delta or a theta. And I'll probably get into reasons why that might be the case here in a little bit. But still, it's very helpful to understand what Vega represents. And it's very helpful to understand these kind of key points about Vega that can help us just become more well-rounded traders and more well-rounded analysts when it comes to thinking about a given trade or monitoring or analyzing a trade on entry. So Ryan, go ahead and bring us into the content here today. The third wheel, as Vega measures how the implied volatility of a stock will change when the underlying stock price changes, there are 3 characteristics of Vega that can be very, very useful. So 3 characteristics, 3 features, 3 tips, 3 points. These 3 things can be very helpful for understanding how Vega changes depending on the different parameters that you might be changing in the analysis. So tip number 1. And we're going to look at a position in a second to kind of put all this together. Tip number 1, long options have positive Vega and short options have negative Vega. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means in a very, very simple and straightforward sense that long options want volatility to rise because a rising volatility will lead to a rising option price, which is good for the option buyer. It is good for the long option holder. Okay. Short options are negative Vega, which simply means that short option holders want volatility to fall. They want volatility to go down. They want volatility to contract. And they want this to happen because lower volatility leads to lower option prices, which is what you want when you sell an option, right? You sell high and then buy low. That's the basic idea behind selling options. Well, when it comes to understanding Vega, it's very helpful to understand, in tip number 1, positive Vega versus negative Vega, right? These are obviously going to be very different. These are obviously going to kind of label or characterize your exposure to volatility in a very, very important way. Like, are you bullish volatility or are you bearish volatility? Tip number 2, Vega is the highest for the at-the-money strike in a given option chain. So for a specific stock and a specific expiration, Vega will be at its maximum point for the at-the-money strike. So anytime you have an at-the-money option, whether you have a current position on that, the stock has just moved such that that option or that strike is at the money right now, you are going to be exposed maximally to the Vega in that position or on that strike. If you're looking at a trade at trade entry and you want more volatility exposure, then you'd want to be around the money. Maybe you want less volatility exposure, then you would not want to be around the money. You'd want to move further out of the money or further in the money, depending on the type of strategy that you might be looking at. And then tip number 3, moving very, very efficient today, because I do want to see if the NASDAQ prints 12,000. I don't want to miss that. I want to be there for that along with all y'all that are on the stream today. Tip number 3, Vega increases with days to expiration. So as you move out further in time, as you expand, the time frame that you might be looking at, you will also see that holding all other variables constant, ceteris paribus for all my Latin groupies out there, you will see that Vega also expands. You will see that Vega is greater for longer term options. And so again, if you're trying to control or minimize or maximize your volatility exposure, it's very helpful to understand, these different tips and tenets that you see inside of, a Vega understanding. With tip number 2, the at-the-money strike commanding the highest Vega. And then tip number 3, the longer duration is also commanding higher Vegas. And so understanding all this, moving down to that green box down there, this helps me better understand the volatility exposure that I might have in a single position, whatever it might be, a strangle, a short put, a ratio, a vertical, whatever, or the overall portfolio writ large, or the overall portfolio in the aggregate sense. Like that can be really, really helpful for trying to understand and again, measure my volatility exposure. And so that is effectively what we can glean from Vega. So Ryan, go ahead and bring us back into the portfolio. Let's look at an example. And then I want to get to all y'all's questions, man. Let me get to all y'all's questions. I see lots of questions coming in. Ryan, go ahead and bring us back into the portfolio here. And so I want to look at an example to tie all this off and kind of put all this stuff together. And once you guys can see this kind of live and you can kind of see this happening in a given stock, my hope is that this will make it very, very clear and evident to you, what might be going on here. So let's see here, Ryan, if you can get us into the portfolio, that would be good. So if we look at Procter and Gamble. So when I thought about NASDAQ down 130, Dow down 300, even the S&P is down 50, I was like, all right, what is the one stock that everybody's looking at? Is it Tesla? I don't think so. Is it Silvergate? I don't think so. The one stock that everybody's worried about is Procter and Gamble. So if we go into Procter and Gamble, PG, people are like, man, I don't know about crypto, but how my soap's going to do? Like, I'm not sure about, the Model 3, but I got to know, like, toothpaste. Where are we at on the toothpaste? And so Procter and Gamble, if we go into the trade page on Procter and Gamble, go into April. So we stay in the April cycle. So the first thing that I want to point out, and this can be a bit confusing, right? If you haven't really, been shown this before, look at the Vega on both sides of the option chain. So the calls and the puts. Calls on the left, obviously, puts on the right. What you'll notice about the Vega is you don't see some positive and some negative, right? And this was tip number one. Like if I buy an option, it's positive Vega. If I sell an option, it's negative Vega. All you see are positive numbers. So if you didn't know better, like this would kind of lead you to believe, all Vegas are positive. That's not true. All Vegas are not positive. It depends on whether or not you buy the option or sell the option. If you buy the option, it's positive Vega. It doesn't matter if it's a call or a put. If you sell the option, it's negative Vega. It doesn't matter if it's a call or a put. And so when you look at how it's presented on the platform, it's simply presented from the viewpoint, from the vantage point of the long option holder. That's why you see deltas are negative for puts and positive for calls. But if I sell a put, it's actually positive delta because I'm not the option buyer. But the Greeks are oftentimes, and by oftentimes I mean always times, presented from the long option holder's perspective. And so that's why you see positive numbers here on these Vegas. But whether or not it's going to be positive for you, ultimately depends on whether or not you buy or sell the option, calls or puts, it doesn't matter. So that's the first tip. The second tip is take a look at, let me clear away these boxes. So right now we've got Procter & Gamble right at about 137 and some change. So we're right between the 135 and the 140 strike. So look at the Vega on the put side between 135 and 140. Look at the Vega on the call side between 135 and 140. And what do you see? You see that the Vega for the at the money strike, which again, we can't perfect the at the money strike. We can't pinpoint it right now because Procter & Gamble is kind of between the two closest strikes. But you can see very clearly that the Vega is at the highest point right around the at the money strike. You see it drops off on both sides of the moneyness story, whether it's out of the money or in the money, it is going to drop off on either side. And so we see maximum Vega for the at the money strike. So we've covered tip number one. We've covered tip number two. Let's now go into tip number three. So if I look at, I'm just going to pick one strike at random here. Let me take a look at, in fact, I'll even pick two just to really make this point. If I look at a 135 put, which is going to be your at the money put or slightly out of the money put. If I look at a 135 put, you see the Vega is 18. If I look at a 125 put, you see the Vega is 10. Now we could do this on the call side too. It would be the same result. And so this is not going to be a put specific phenomenon. This is going to happen with any strike or any call that you might look at. Now I want to look at, we know what these are in April. I know the 135 is 18. I know the 125 is 10. I want to know, what are these in May? So if I look at the same strikes, same stock, I try to control as many variables as I can, and I only change the expiration. If tip number three is correct, which I sure hope it is at this point because it's already on the slide, we've already covered it by now. If that is correct, then I should see higher Vegas for both of these numbers. Right? The 135 should be higher than 18 and the 125 should be higher than 10. So cross your fingers. I really hope this works out. If I go into May, look at the 135. The 135 Vega is 24. So again, I'm no Jacob Perlman, but that's more than 18. But look at the 125. That's 15. Again, I'm no Julia Spina, but that's more than 10. So that works out. That's good. Right, we see higher Vegas with more days to expiration. And so this really kind of ties together what we were talking about on the slide, tip one, tip two, and tip three. And again, how do you use these? you can use them to measure the volatility exposure that's in your portfolio. But admittedly, I don't look at Vega that often because I actually feel like everything I would need to know in terms of volatility exposure, in terms of, how much, negative Vega, positive Vega that I might have is effectively going to be baked into the theta number at the portfolio level. And at a certain point, there's too many things to monitor. Like at a certain point, it's like, all right, I can't babysit anything else. I've already got, 3 small children. Like we're maxed out. I have no more bandwidth. I have no more capacity. Like, sure, you can bring Vega in and drop it off, but I can't promise you that I'm going to pay attention to it. Like, I can't promise you that it's still going to have a beating heart when you come to pick it up. I'll do my best, but this is all I can do. I'm only one man. And so it's the same thing here, exact same idea with a pretty below average analogy.